You are done here! Get out of my bank! I'm not leaving until we finish this conversation.
I am the manager of this private bank, and I am ordering you to leave the premises right now.
This is escalating too quickly. Yes, we have a small issue here. I need to terminate this board meeting immediately.
By the time Malcolm Hayes reached the private elevator, everyone in the lobby had already decided he did not belong there. It was 8:17 on a Monday morning, the hour when Whitestone Capital Bank looked less like a bank and more like a cathedral built for money. Sunlight spilled through 40-foot glass walls and broke across the white marble floor in clean golden strips. Men in tailored navy suits moved through the lobby with leather briefcases and quiet confidence. Women in silk blouses and polished heels passed security without slowing down. No one raised a hand to stop them. No one asked where they were going. Then Malcolm stepped inside. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, calm, and dressed in a charcoal overcoat that had seen better winters. His shoes were polished, but old. His watch was simple. In his left hand, he carried a brown leather envelope, worn at the corners, the kind of thing a courier might carry if nobody looked too closely. He did not rush. He did not look around like a man impressed by the ceiling or the chandeliers or the glass staircase curving toward the executive offices. He moved with the quiet patience of someone returning to a place that had once taken something from him. The receptionist noticed him first. Her smile appeared, then weakened. A young associate near the coffee bar paused with a paper cup halfway to his mouth. Two clients standing beside the brass directory turned slightly, not enough to stare, just enough to make their judgment visible. Malcolm walked past all of them toward the private elevator at the far end of the lobby, the one without a sign, the one framed in brushed gold and guarded by a small black access panel. Only certain people knew what was above the 42nd floor. Families with old money. Tech founders hiding nine-figure exits. Retired senators. Real estate heirs. Clients whose accounts were not measured in thousands, but in generations. Malcolm reached for the panel, and before his fingers touched it, a white security guard in a dark blazer stepped in front of him. The guard's name tag read Derek Miller. His face carried the stiff politeness of a man who had already made up his mind and wanted the rulebook to do the talking for him. "Sir," Derek said, keeping his voice low but firm, "this elevator is restricted." Malcolm looked at him, not offended, not surprised. "I know." Derek blinked once. Behind him, the elevator doors reflected both men like a polished mirror, one blocking the way, the other standing still enough to make the entire lobby feel louder. "Private banking is by appointment only," Derek added. "I'm expected." Malcolm's voice was calm, almost gentle. That was when Richard Caldwell appeared from the right side of the lobby, adjusting one silver cufflink as if he had been summoned by the scent of inconvenience. Richard was 45, tall, white, perfectly dressed, and known throughout Whitestone as the man who protected the private banking floor from embarrassment. He smiled at Malcolm the way wealthy people smile at a problem they believe can be removed quietly. "Good morning," Richard said. "I'm Richard Caldwell, Director of Private Client Services. Is there something I can help you with down here?" The last two words landed softly, but everyone nearby heard them. "Down here." Malcolm turned toward him. "I have business on 42. Richard's eyes moved from Malcolm's coat to the leather envelope, then to his shoes. It took less than 2 seconds, but it told the whole story. "I see," Richard said. "And who are you here to see?" Malcolm held his gaze. "The board." A small silence opened in the lobby. Somewhere behind the reception desk, a phone stopped ringing. Richard's smile did not disappear, but it tightened. "The board doesn't take unscheduled meetings. This one was scheduled 6 weeks ago." Richard gave a quiet breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite enough to be called rude. "Sir, we have clients upstairs who value privacy. I'm sure you understand." Malcolm did understand. He understood every word Richard had not said. He understood the glance toward security. He understood the way the receptionist looked down at her screen to avoid witnessing anything. He understood the old familiar weight of being measured before being heard. But he also understood something Richard did not. The floor they were protecting was no longer theirs to protect. Malcolm shifted the leather envelope under his arm and looked at the gold elevator doors. For a moment, his reflection stared back at him, older now, quieter now, but standing in the same building where his mother had once stood with a folder full of hope and walked out with nothing. Then he looked back at Richard and said, "You may want to call upstairs before this goes any further." Richard's smile finally faded. "That won't be necessary." And just like that, the lobby went still. Richard Caldwell had built his entire career on knowing who was allowed past certain doors. At Whitestone Capital, that skill had made him valuable. He remembered names, family histories, yacht clubs, country clubs, endowment funds, and the quiet language of old wealth. He knew which clients preferred sparkling water at room temperature, which widows wanted no mention of their late husbands, which heirs liked to be greeted by first name, and which billionaires pretended not to enjoy special treatment while expecting it at every turn. To Richard, private banking was not about money alone. It was about presentation. The right watch. The right shoes. The right confidence. The right skin tone in the right room, though he would never have said that part out loud. Instead, he hid it inside phrases like client comfort, security protocol, and brand protection. Standing in the lobby that morning, he saw Malcolm Hayes as a disruption to that image. Not a threat, not yet. Just a mistake that needed to be corrected before the wrong client noticed. "Sir," Richard said, lowering his voice as if offering Malcolm a favor, "there are proper channels for deliveries and general inquiries. Our staff at reception can direct you." Malcolm did not move. "I am not here to make a delivery." Richard glanced at the brown leather envelope tucked beneath Malcolm's arm. Of course. The word was polite. The meaning was not. Derek Miller shifted beside the elevator, uncomfortable but still planted in place. A few feet away, Evelyn Brooks stood near the reception counter with a tablet in her hand, watching the exchange from behind a professional expression that had taken 15 years to perfect. Evelyn was one of Whitestone's senior relationship managers, trusted by families whose names appeared on museum wings and hospital buildings. She had seen difficult clients, nervous heirs, arrogant executives, and ambitious men pretending to be richer than they were. But there was something different about Malcolm. He did not perform outrage. He did not plead. He did not raise his voice to claim importance. He simply stood there as if time itself had chosen his side. "May I have your name?" Richard asked, finally allowing a touch of impatience into his tone. "Malcolm Hayes." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the tablet. The name struck something in her memory, faint but sharp, like a bell ringing behind a closed door. Hayes. She had seen it recently. Not in a client request. Not in a complaint. Somewhere higher. Somewhere confidential. Richard turned slightly toward the receptionist. "Check the appointment system for a Malcolm Hayes." The receptionist typed quickly, grateful for something to do. Her eyes scanned the screen. "I do not see him listed for private client services." Richard turned back with the satisfaction of a man who believed the building itself had just agreed with him. There may have been some confusion. Malcolm looked toward the elevator panel. "There has been confusion, yes." A quiet ripple moved through the lobby. The sentence was simple, but it carried weight. Richard heard it and stiffened. "Mr. Hayes, we have policies for a reason. This floor serves a very specific category of client." "I am aware." "Then you understand why we cannot allow anyone to access it just because they say they have business there." Malcolm looked at the clients passing through the lobby, then back at Richard. Did they all have to prove it? The question landed cleanly. No anger. No accusation. Just truth, placed in the open where everyone could see it. Richard's jaw tightened. Derek looked away. The receptionist stopped typing. Evelyn felt her stomach sink because she already knew the answer. 2 white clients had walked through that same private elevator less than 5 minutes earlier. No one had asked for identification. No one had checked the system in front of the lobby. No one had treated their presence like a problem to be solved. Richard recovered quickly. Men like him always did. This is not about them, he said. This is about protocol. Malcolm nodded once, as if he had expected that exact word. Protocol is useful when it protects people. It becomes something else when it only protects assumptions. Evelyn looked down at her tablet again, suddenly searching her inbox with her thumb. Hayes. Acquisition. Controlling interest. Her breath caught when a sealed board memorandum flashed across the screen, its subject line partially visible from the week before. She opened it, read the first line, and felt the blood leave her face. Richard was still speaking, still explaining, still building a wall out of polished words, completely unaware that the wall had already begun to crack. Evelyn Brooks read the memorandum twice, but the words did not change. Effective immediately, controlling interest in Whitestone Capital Bank had been transferred to Hayes Meridian Holdings, a private investment group led by Malcolm Hayes. The sentence sat on her screen like a quiet thunderclap. 6 weeks ago, the bank had changed hands in a deal so confidential that only the board, outside counsel, and a narrow circle of senior officers had been allowed to see the details. Evelyn remembered the instructions clearly. Do not discuss. Do not forward. Do not speculate. The new owner would visit the Manhattan headquarters when the transition became official. That visit, according to the memorandum, was scheduled for Monday morning at 8:30. Evelyn looked at the time in the corner of her tablet. 8:22. Her mouth went dry. Across the lobby, Richard Caldwell was still standing between Malcolm and the elevator, still confident, still unaware that every second was making the moment worse. Mr. Hayes, Richard said, now speaking with the patient tone adults use when they think they are being reasonable with someone who does not understand, I am going to ask you to step away from the executive elevator. Our private clients expect discretion, and this kind of scene is not appropriate for the lobby. Malcolm slowly turned his head and looked around. No one was speaking. The marble lobby had become a theater of silent witnesses. A man in a gray suit pretended to read a message on his phone, though his thumb never moved. A woman near the floral arrangement watched over the rim of her coffee cup. The receptionist kept her eyes on the screen, but her shoulders had gone stiff. Derek Miller stood with one hand clasped over the other, no longer looking as certain as he had a minute earlier. I agree, Malcolm said. This kind of scene is not appropriate. Richard mistook the sentence for surrender. Good. Then reception can help you with whatever department you need. Malcolm did not step away. Instead, he shifted the brown leather envelope from one hand to the other and asked, Do you know what was on this corner before Whitestone built this tower? Richard frowned, thrown off by the question. Excuse me. Before the marble. Before the glass. Before the private elevator. Richard's patience thinned. That is not relevant. It was a grocery store, Malcolm said. Small place. Family owned. My mother bought flour there every Friday after her shift at the hospital. Something in his voice changed then. Not louder. Not softer. Deeper. The kind of quiet that made people lean in without realizing it. When she came to this bank in 1997, she had 3 pay stubs, 8 years of clean credit, and enough savings for a down payment. She wanted a loan to keep our house after my father died. Evelyn stopped breathing for a moment. She had expected a corporate reveal. She had not expected a wound. Richard gave a tight smile, the kind people use when empathy would cost them too much. Mr. Hayes, I am sorry for whatever experience your family may have had, but that does not give you access to restricted areas today. Malcolm looked at him for a long second. No. Ownership does. The word hovered in the lobby, but Richard refused to hear it. You cannot simply claim ownership of a financial institution in the middle of the lobby. I did not claim it in the lobby. Malcolm's eyes stayed steady. I signed the papers 6 weeks ago. Evelyn moved before. She fully decided to move. She stepped away from the reception counter, tablet in hand, but Richard shot her a warning glance sharp enough to stop her in place. Evelyn, he said quietly, not now. That was the moment Malcolm reached into his coat pocket and removed a thin black card with no logo on its face, only a narrow silver strip across the center. It did not look like a bank card. It did not look like a visitor badge. It looked like something designed for people who never had to explain themselves. Richard almost laughed. Mr. Hayes, that panel will not respond to unauthorized credentials. Malcolm turned toward the elevator. His hand moved slowly, calmly, with the entire lobby watching. The black card touched the access panel. For 1 second, nothing happened. Richard's mouth began to form another polished correction. Then every light above the private elevator changed from white to deep blue. The security panel gave a soft chime that echoed across the marble. The brass directory went dark, then refreshed with a single line of text that made the lobby fall completely silent. Welcome, Mr. Hayes. Owner access granted. For a few seconds, no one moved. The words on the brass directory were too simple to misunderstand, yet the lobby seemed unable to accept them. Welcome, Mr. Hayes. Owner access granted. The private elevator stood open behind Malcolm, its polished doors reflecting Richard Caldwell's face as the color drained from it one shade at a time. Derek Miller took a careful step back, his hands dropping to his sides. The receptionist stared at the screen as if the building itself had betrayed her. Evelyn Brooks lowered her tablet, because there was nothing left to verify. The truth had announced itself in blue light and quiet machinery. Malcolm did not smile. He did not look satisfied. That made the moment worse for Richard. Anger would have given him something to resist. Humiliation would have given him something to dismiss. But Malcolm's calm left him standing in the open with only his own choices around him. There must be some kind of system error, Richard said, though his voice no longer carried authority. It came out thin, almost. Careful. That access panel has been malfunctioning for weeks. Nobody believed him. Not Derek. Not Evelyn. Not the clients pretending not to watch. Not even Richard himself. Malcolm turned from the elevator and faced him. Is that your explanation? Richard swallowed. I am saying we need to confirm before allowing anyone upstairs. You needed confirmation when I gave you my name. You needed confirmation when I told you I was expected. You needed confirmation when I asked you to call upstairs. Malcolm paused, and the silence sharpened. But you did not need confirmation before deciding I did not belong here. The words were not loud, but they traveled across the lobby with the force of a closing door. Evelyn felt them settle somewhere deep. She had spent years telling herself that Whitestone was changing, that the old assumptions had softened, that polished manners were not the same as prejudice. But that morning, watching Malcolm stand in front of the elevator with every credential Richard had demanded and every dignity Richard had ignored, she could no longer pretend the difference was unclear. Richard straightened his jacket as if fabric could restore control. Mr. Hayes, with respect, you have to understand the sensitivity of this floor. We are responsible for protecting high net worth clients. Protecting them from what? Malcolm asked. Richard did not answer quickly enough. A soft sound came from the elevator, another chime, and the display above the doors changed. Executive descent in progress. Everyone looked up. The elevator was no longer waiting for Malcolm to enter. Someone was coming down. Richard saw the message and his expression tightened into something close to fear. Evelyn knew why. Only a handful of people could activate that elevator from above without a floor request. Board members. Legal counsel. The chairman's office. The descent seemed to take longer than it should have. The numbers glowed one by one, moving down from 42 while the entire lobby watched in a silence so complete that the soft hum of the ventilation system became audible. 40. 37. 32. Malcolm stood with the leather envelope beneath his arm. Eyes forward. He looked nothing like the man Richard had tried to redirect to reception. He looked like a verdict waiting for the room to catch up. When the elevator reached the lobby, the doors opened with a smooth whisper. Charles Whitmore stepped out first. 71 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a dark suit, he carried the tired dignity of a man who had spent half his life inside rooms where ordinary people were never invited. Behind him came 2 attorneys, 3 board members, and a woman from corporate communications who looked as though she had just walked into a public relations emergency. Charles took in the scene with one glance: Malcolm outside the elevator, Richard blocking his path, Derek standing aside, Evelyn frozen with the memorandum still open on her tablet. His face changed, not dramatically, but enough. Disappointment settled over it like winter shade. Malcolm, Charles said, and the first name struck the lobby harder than any announcement could have. He walked directly to Malcolm and extended his hand. Malcolm shook it once. Charles. Richard's lips parted, but no sound came out. Charles turned to him slowly. Mr. Caldwell, would you like to explain why the owner of this bank is standing in the lobby instead of in the boardroom? The question did not need volume. It had status behind it. It had witnesses behind it. It had every careless word Richard had spoken behind it. Richard looked from Charles to Malcolm, then to the open elevator, searching for a version of events that could save him. But there was no version left. There was only the man he had stopped, the door he had guarded, and the truth he had been too proud to recognize. Charles Whitmore did not raise his voice, and somehow that made the question feel heavier. Richard Caldwell stood 3 feet from the open elevator, trapped between the polished world he had spent years controlling and the truth that had just stepped through it. Mr. Whitmore, Richard began, forcing the words through a dry throat, there was a misunderstanding regarding credentials. Standard security protocol required us to verify access before allowing entry to a restricted floor. Charles looked at Malcolm, then back at Richard. Did Mr. Hayes refuse to provide his name? No, but the system did not show an appointment under private client services. Because he is not a private client. Charles let the sentence hang for a moment. He is the controlling owner. The lobby absorbed the words in pieces. Controlling owner. Not visitor. Not courier. Not confused customer. Owner. The clients near the brass directory lowered their eyes. Derek Miller stared at the marble floor. The receptionist's face flushed with embarrassment, though she had only done what she had been told to do. Evelyn Brooks held her tablet against her chest, feeling the sharp ache of recognition. This was how systems worked when nobody questioned them. One person assumed. Another person obeyed. A third person looked away. By the time the truth arrived, everyone had helped build the wall. Malcolm stepped forward, not toward Richard, but toward the center of the lobby. I want something understood, he said. His voice was calm enough to pull every ear toward it. I did not come here this morning looking for an apology in front of strangers. I came for a board meeting. Richard's shoulders relaxed by the smallest fraction, as if he believed mercy might still be available. Then Malcolm turned slightly, and his eyes settled on him. But what happened here matters because it was not an accident. The relaxation vanished. Malcolm lifted the brown leather envelope. For the first time, the object everyone had judged became the center of the room. This is why I came in through the lobby instead of the private garage. Charles's expression changed, almost imperceptibly. He knew what was inside. The board members behind him exchanged uneasy glances. Malcolm opened the envelope and removed a faded folder protected inside a clear sleeve. The paper had yellowed around the edges. A red stamp marked the front. Rejected. The word was old, but it still looked fresh enough to hurt. 27 years ago, Malcolm said, my mother stood in this building when it was still half the size and twice as cold. Her name was Loretta Hayes. She worked 12-hour shifts at St. Agnes Medical Center. She had never missed a credit card payment. She had saved enough for a down payment on a small house in Queens. After my father died, that house was the only thing keeping our family steady. No one moved. Even Richard seemed unable to look away from the folder. She came here because this bank advertised itself as a place that helped working families build futures. She waited 2 hours. She was told her application was incomplete, though every document was inside this folder. She was told the neighborhood she wanted to buy in was unstable. She was told to come back when her financial profile looked stronger. Malcolm looked down at the red stamp. 3 months later, we lost the house. The lobby felt smaller now. The marble did not shine the same way. The glass walls seemed colder. Evelyn felt tears pressing behind her eyes, but she held still. Malcolm did not sound broken. That was what made it unbearable. He sounded like a man who had carried the story so long that pain had turned into purpose. Richard finally found his voice. Mr. Hayes, I cannot speak to something that happened before my time. Malcolm looked up. I am not asking you to speak for the past. I am asking you to explain why it was still present 5 minutes ago. The sentence landed with quiet precision. Richard had no answer. Charles closed his eyes for half a second, not in denial, but in shame. Malcolm placed the folder back into the envelope with careful hands. This morning, you did not see an owner. You did not see a scheduled meeting. You did not see a man with legal authority to enter the 42nd floor. You saw a black man in an old coat and decided the building needed protection from him. Derek swallowed hard. The receptionist lowered her head. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since Malcolm had entered the lobby, he had nothing polished left to say. Malcolm turned toward the open elevator, then stopped. We will still have our meeting, he said. But the first item on the agenda has changed. The elevator carried Malcolm Hayes, Charles Whitmore, Evelyn Brooks, Richard Caldwell, and the board delegation upward in a silence that felt heavier than steel. No one looked at the mirrored walls for long, because the reflection told the truth too clearly. Richard stood near the corner with his hands folded in front of him, his face pale, his posture still formal but no longer confident. Evelyn stood beside Charles, holding her tablet as if it might anchor her in a moment that had already shifted the entire building beneath her feet. Malcolm stood closest to the doors, the brown leather envelope tucked under one arm, eyes fixed on the glowing numbers above the panel. 21. 28. 35. Every floor they passed seemed to lift him farther from the lobby, but not from the memory of his mother standing there with hope in her hands and fear in her throat. When the doors opened on 42, the private banking floor appeared exactly as Richard had always wanted it to appear. Quiet. Perfect. Untouched. Thick carpet softened every step. Frosted glass walls hid conference rooms where fortunes were arranged in whispers. Fresh orchids sat on black stone tables. A panoramic view of Manhattan stretched beyond the windows, bright and distant, as if the city itself had been placed there for the comfort of people who owned pieces of it. Malcolm stepped out first. A young assistant rose from behind a curved walnut desk, smile ready, then froze when she saw the faces coming out behind him. Conference room A, Charles said quietly. Now. Inside the room, 12 leather chairs surrounded a table long enough to make distance feel intentional. Malcolm did not sit at the head immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and looked down. 42 floors below, yellow taxis moved along the avenue like small sparks. People crossed streets with coffee cups, backpacks, delivery bags, and morning worries. From up here, everyone looked equal because everyone looked small. Malcolm turned back to the room. This floor was designed to separate people, he said. That is not always wrong. Privacy has value. Security has value. But somewhere along the way, separation became judgment. Richard kept his eyes on the table. One of the attorneys opened a folder, ready to begin a formal process, but Malcolm lifted one hand. Slightly, and the room stilled. Before we discuss legal exposure, public statements, or personnel consequences, I want to know how many times this happened before today. No one answered. That silence was different from the lobby silence. Downstairs, people had been shocked. Up here, they were calculating. Malcolm noticed. Not this exact moment, he continued. Not me. I mean the pattern. People redirected before they were heard. Clients questioned more aggressively than others. Applicants dismissed because they did not look like the bank's idea of wealth. Entrepreneurs denied access because their success did not come wrapped in the right packaging. Evelyn felt the words pull something out of her that she had kept buried for years. She remembered a black dentist from Atlanta who had been asked for additional verification twice despite transferring millions from a practice sale. She remembered a Latina founder from Austin who had waited 40 minutes while a white client with no appointment was greeted by name. She remembered telling herself each incident was isolated. She remembered how easy that lie had become. Malcolm looked directly at her, not accusing, simply inviting truth. Evelyn set her tablet on the table. It was not isolated, she said. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. Richard looked up sharply. Evelyn. She did not turn toward him. It was not always open. It was not always documented. But it happened. The standards were not applied evenly. The room changed again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But the balance shifted. Someone had finally said the quiet part inside the room where quiet parts were usually protected. Malcolm nodded once. Thank you. Richard leaned forward, desperation replacing polish. With respect, this is a serious accusation. Private banking requires discretion. There are risk factors. There are compliance obligations. Staff make judgment calls under pressure. Malcolm looked at him for a long moment. Judgment calls reveal judgment. The sentence ended the defense before it could grow. Charles folded his hands. Malcolm, what do you want done? Malcolm opened the brown envelope and placed his mother's rejected loan file in the center of the table. Then he placed his black access card beside it. The old paper and the modern credential sat together like two chapters of the same story. First, Mr. Caldwell is to be placed on administrative leave pending an independent review. Second, every access denial, escalated identity check, and private banking referral rejection from the last 10 years will be audited by outside counsel. Third, the board will authorize a new client access policy by the end of the day, one that protects privacy without disguising prejudice as professionalism. No one interrupted. Malcolm's voice remained even. And fourth, this floor will no longer be measured by who it keeps out. It will be measured by whether the right people can finally get in. Richard Caldwell had spent years believing that consequences were things that happened to other people. They happened to junior associates who missed calls, assistants who sent documents to the wrong client, tellers who mishandled forms, applicants who failed to meet standards written by people who never had to question whether those standards were fair. But now, seated at the long conference table on the 42nd floor, Richard felt the room moving on without him. The attorneys were already taking notes. Charles Whitmore was already speaking with the chair of the audit committee. Evelyn Brooks was already being asked to provide examples, dates, and internal records. The machine Richard had trusted to protect him had begun protecting itself instead. Administrative leave is not an admission of wrongdoing, one attorney said carefully, using the calm language of institutions trying to survive their own reflection. Malcolm nodded once. Then it should not be difficult to begin. Richard looked at Malcolm with something between disbelief and resentment. You are making an example out of me. Malcolm turned toward him. No. You made an example in the lobby. I am making a record. The room went quiet again, but this time it did not feel dramatic. It felt procedural, and that frightened Richard more than anger would have. Anger burns hot and fades. Procedure files paperwork. Procedure collects signatures. Procedure asks for archived emails and security logs and visitor records. Procedure remembers what powerful people hope everyone else will forget. Evelyn's tablet was connected to the conference screen now. One by one, she pulled up access reports from the private banking desk. Names appeared. Timestamps. Notes written in polite language. Referred to general services. Identity verification incomplete. Client profile inconsistent with private banking criteria. Some entries were reasonable. Some were not. The problem was not one line. It was the pattern between the lines. Malcolm watched without interrupting. He did not need every detail yet. He only needed enough for the room to understand that what had happened downstairs was not a strange accident produced by one nervous morning. It was a symptom. A well-dressed symptom. A symptom with marble floors, soft lighting, and legal disclaimers. Charles leaned back, his face heavier than it had been in the lobby. How did we not see this? Evelyn answered before she could lose courage. Some people did see it. They just learned not to say it too loudly. Her voice did not accuse the room. That made it worse. It included the room. Richard shook his head. This is unfair. You are taking ordinary caution and turning it into something ugly. Malcolm looked at the old loan file still resting in the center of the table. Ordinary caution has a history in buildings like this. He touched the edge of the folder, not opening it, only reminding the room that it was there. It often arrives dressed as policy. It often sounds reasonable. It often asks for one more document, one more verification, one more reason to wait. And the people being delayed are told not to take it personally. Richard's face tightened. I never mentioned race. You did not have to. The answer was gentle, and it ended him. Not because it was loud. Because everyone in the room knew exactly what Malcolm meant. The attorney beside Charles closed his folder. Mr. Caldwell, Human Resources will meet with you immediately following this session. Your system access will be temporarily suspended pending review. Richard looked around for an ally and found only lowered eyes. For the first time all morning, he seemed smaller than his suit. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with hands that were not quite steady. At the door, he turned back as if one final polished sentence might recover the ground beneath him. None came. The door closed softly behind him. No slam. No spectacle. Just the sound of status leaving the room. Malcolm let the silence settle, then looked at Evelyn. You spoke when it mattered. Evelyn lowered her eyes. I should have spoken sooner. Most people should have, Malcolm said. The question is what they do after they realize it. Outside the glass wall, Manhattan glittered in the morning sun, indifferent and alive. Inside the room, the bank began to change, not with applause, not with speeches, but with instructions. Pull the records. Notify outside counsel. Freeze discretionary access decisions. Schedule staff interviews. Review denial patterns by branch, zip code, and relationship manager. Words that sounded dry to anyone else sounded to Malcolm like doors unlocking one by one. Then Evelyn looked at the folder in the center of the table. What was your mother's first name? Malcolm's expression softened for the first time that morning. Loretta. Evelyn nodded slowly. Then the new initiative should carry her name. Charles looked up. The board members exchanged glances. Malcolm said nothing for several seconds. Behind his calm eyes, something old and wounded moved. Finally, He placed his hand flat on the folder and said, "Not as charity. As correction." Evelyn nodded. The Loretta Hayes Open Door Initiative. Malcolm looked toward the windows, down at the city his mother had fought to stay in, and for the first time since entering Whitestone that morning, he allowed himself one quiet breath. By noon, the 42nd floor no longer felt untouched. The orchid still sat on the black stone tables, the carpet still swallowed every footstep, and the skyline still glittered beyond the glass, but something invisible had shifted. People moved differently when they knew the old rules were being examined. Assistants spoke more carefully. Senior managers checked their inboxes with uneasy eyes. The private banking floor had always been quiet, but now the quiet had weight. Malcolm Hayes remained in conference room A while the bank began opening parts of itself it had kept sealed for years. Reports arrived in secure folders. Access logs appeared on the screen. Branch managers joined by video from Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, Los Angeles, and Miami. Some looked confused. Some looked nervous. A few looked as though they had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. Evelyn Brooks sat to Malcolm's right, no longer hiding behind professional neutrality. She had been asked to lead the first internal review, and the responsibility had settled on her like both a burden and a chance. When she spoke, her voice was clear. We need to look beyond private banking access. Loan referrals, small business denials, wealth management onboarding, complaint resolution, all of it. If the pattern exists upstairs, it may exist downstairs too. Charles Whitmore looked older with every sentence, but he did not resist. Then we look. Malcolm watched him closely. Charles had inherited Whitestone from men who believed reputation mattered more than repair. For most of his career, he had protected the institution by smoothing over problems before they became public. Now, sitting across from the man who had bought the bank and brought his mother's rejected file back into its highest room, Charles seemed to understand that smoothing was no longer enough. The first call came from the Queens branch. An assistant manager admitted that certain applicants had often been sent for extra documentation even when their files were complete. The second came from Dallas, where a former relationship officer described how promising business owners were sometimes told they were not ready for premium services while less qualified clients were invited in because they came through the right social circles. The third came from Chicago, where a compliance analyst quietly uploaded a spreadsheet she had kept for 2 years because something about the denial patterns had never looked right to her. The spreadsheet filled the conference screen with rows of names, numbers, zip codes, and outcomes. No single cell looked dramatic. Together, they looked like a locked door with thousands of small hinges. Malcolm leaned forward. His face remained calm, but Evelyn saw the grief underneath it. Not only for his mother. For every person whose future had been delayed by a polite no that never explained itself honestly. How many? Charles asked. The compliance analyst on the screen hesitated. Potentially hundreds over the last decade. Possibly more if older records are restored. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Outside the room, a cart rolled by with coffee cups and silver lids, a normal sound from a normal workday that suddenly felt out of place. Malcolm looked at the old folder in front of him. Loretta Hayes had been one name in one file. One woman with 3 pay stubs and a house she tried to save. But now the room could see what Malcolm had always understood. A file was never just paper. It was a life paused, redirected, or quietly denied. Evelyn turned to him. What do you want to do first? Malcolm looked around the table, then at the faces on the video screen. First, we stop pretending this is only about customer service. He placed the black access card beside his mother's folder again. Second, every applicant affected by improper review gets contacted. Not with a public relations letter. With a real review, a real explanation, and where appropriate, a real remedy. One attorney shifted in his seat. That could expose the bank to significant liability. Malcolm's eyes moved to him. The liability began when the harm began. We are only deciding whether to face it honestly. The attorney said nothing else. Evelyn wrote the words down. Real review. Real explanation. Real remedy. They did not sound like a slogan. They sounded like work. Malcolm stood and walked to the window. Far below, the lobby entrance looked small, almost harmless, but he could still feel the moment Derek's hand had blocked the elevator, still hear Richard's soft voice telling him that clients upstairs valued privacy. He wondered how many people had turned away from that lobby carrying humiliation they never told anyone about. He wondered how many had blamed themselves. When he turned back, his voice was quieter. My mother used to say a closed door teaches you two things. It teaches you who wants you outside, and it teaches you how badly you want to build your own key. He looked at the people in the room. Today, we start making keys. The first public sign appeared 3 weeks later, not in a press conference and not in a glossy campaign, but on the glass doors of Whitestone Capital Bank just below the brass handles. It was a simple line in black lettering: the Loretta Hayes Open Door Initiative begins today. Most people walking along the avenue did not know what it meant. They did not know about the woman who had once stood in that lobby with pay stubs in her purse and hope folded inside a loan application. They did not know about the son who had carried her rejected file for 27 years, not as a symbol of bitterness, but as proof that memory could become a blueprint. But inside Whitestone, everyone knew. Richard Caldwell never returned to the 42nd floor. The independent review found what Malcolm already suspected: uneven access standards, selective scrutiny, and a culture that had confused exclusivity with excellence. The report did not turn every employee into a villain, and Malcolm refused to let it become a story about one man alone. That would have been too easy. One man could be removed. A system had to be rebuilt. Derek Miller, the guard who had blocked the elevator, was not fired immediately. Malcolm asked to speak with him privately. Derek walked into the meeting expecting punishment, his face tense, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Malcolm offered him a chair. You followed an assumption before you followed a fact, Malcolm said. Derek lowered his head. Yes, sir. Do you understand the difference now? Derek nodded. I think I do. Malcolm watched him for a moment, then said, thinking is not enough. Learning has to change what you do next. Derek was reassigned, retrained, and later became one of the first security supervisors to help redesign lobby access procedures. Evelyn Brooks became director of the new initiative. Under her leadership, Whitestone reopened hundreds of files, contacted families and business owners who had once been dismissed, and created a review board with members from outside the bank. Some cases led to corrected decisions. Some led to apologies. Some led to financial remedies. Not every wound could be repaired, but for the first time, the bank stopped pretending the wounds were imaginary. On a cold Friday morning in March, Malcolm returned to the lobby alone. He wore the same charcoal overcoat. The marble floor still reflected the morning sun. The private elevator still stood at the far end, framed in gold. But something had changed. There was now a staffed welcome desk beside it with clear access guidelines printed in plain language. No hidden rules. No silent tests. No guessing who belonged. A young black woman in a business suit approached the desk carrying a folder and a nervous smile. Her name was Denise Carter. She owned a small logistics company in Newark and had been invited upstairs after a second review of an application that had once been denied without explanation. Malcolm watched as the associate greeted her by name, verified her appointment with courtesy, and walked her to the elevator without making her feel small. Denise stepped inside, and just before the doors closed, she looked back at the lobby with the stunned expression of someone who had expected another wall and found an opening instead. Malcolm stood still long after the elevator rose. Evelyn found him there a minute later. First full week, she said softly. 23 reviewed clients admitted to private banking meetings. 47 small business applications reopened. 8 families contacted about historic mortgage files. Malcolm nodded, eyes still on the elevator. Good. Evelyn looked at him. Your mother would have been proud. For the first time, Malcolm did not answer right away. He reached into his coat and removed a copy of Loretta Hayes's old rejected file, now preserved in a new folder with her name printed cleanly across the front. He walked to the center of the lobby, where the sunlight crossed the marble, and looked toward the place where Richard had once stood blocking his path. She did not want revenge, he said. She wanted a fair chance. Evelyn stood beside him in silence. Around them, the lobby continued moving. Clients entered. Employees answered phones. The city pressed against the glass with all its noise and urgency. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, something lasting had shifted.